Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. So, if you've listened to this show for any length of time, you've probably heard me say something to the effect of, I don't have the gift of faith, I have the gift of skepticism. And often I kind of say that in like a joking sort of manner. But the Bible talks about faith being a gift and a fruit. And scholars have for centuries now separated the two. That there is a faith that everyone is gifted. And by that I mean faith isn't something that is necessarily manifest in and of each person, but is something that is the byproduct of revelation, and in many cases, as is mine, a combination of revelation and logical processing and volition. In other words, there's a part of faith that can be found, that can be discovered and attained through logic, through thinking through these things, and choosing to believe and have faith. And then there's a part of faith that can't be found that way. There's a part of faith that has to be revealed. There's a part of faith that has to be given, that it's a part of Christian doctrine, that everyone's faith is a gift from God. So in other words, unless God chooses that you believe in him, you won't believe in him. And we could get off on a whole other tangent right now on this episode and talk about that whole reality, that how much of your faith is a product of you choosing to believe in God, and how much of your faith is a product of God choosing for you to believe in him. And we'll suffice it to say both and right now. And if you want more context on that, I've touched on it on other episodes, but we could go in depth further on a future episode. If you so desire, just let me know. And so having received the initial faith for salvation, there are two passages in the New Testament that talk about faith as a fruit and faith as a gift. So in Galatians chapter 5, Paul says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, to another the word of knowledge through the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another different kinds of tongues, to another interpretations of tongues. But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing each one individually as he wills. And so there's a clear differentiation here between the fruit of the Spirit being faithfulness and a unique gifting of the Spirit given to some. And when Paul is talking about some, he's not talking about unbelievers and believers, he's talking about believers in total. And so some believers are given a different kind of faith, a manifestation of the Spirit as a gift, according to 1 Corinthians. And yet, to all believers, there's a fruit of the Spirit that is faithfulness. And so, before we get into this, I think it's probably helpful to understand what we mean when we talk about faith. And faith, I think, is deeper than just a trust, but it's a trust that leads to action, that faith has an active component. Otherwise, it would just be believing. And I think believing is you can just know something's true, trust that it's true, but it doesn't actually lead to action. And even when Jesus talks about faith so small as a mustard seed that could move mountains, the direct manifestation of that faith is an action, is moving mountains. And I don't think Jesus literally meant move mountains. I think he meant metaphorically move mountains. But there's a mighty work, a mighty acting that happens as a part of this faith. And so I think that's probably important to understand when it comes to the gifts. And I think something else that also stands out to me is that I don't know that this gift is necessarily in isolation. Because he says in the following phrase, another is given gifts of healing by the same Spirit, and another the working of miracles. And I kind of paused and thought about that for a second, and really all healings are miracles. Like if you're praying for healing for somebody and it happens with no medical intervention, that's a miracle. But not all miracles are healings. And so there's a lack of categorical breakdown in the gifts. In other words, not each gift is its own category. Another example is the speaking in different kinds of tongues. Now, if you speak in a tongue, especially a tongue that you do not know and did not take the time to learn, again, I would say that's a miracle, but not all miracles are tongues. And so, by that same logic, perhaps praying for a healing is a gift of faith, but not all gifts of faith are healings. And perhaps speaking in tongues is a gift of faith, but not all gifts of faith are speaking in tongues. And so the term then, I think, broadens a little bit. I think there's an idea that a gift of faith is a miraculous trusting in a circumstance that warrants absolutely no trust. And I think this is where I typically kind of jab at myself and say, I don't have the gift of faith, I have the gift of skepticism, because I need to see the logic in every situation. And I need to see the rationality and the connection and the proof in every situation. Maybe not the proof, but the evidence. And I think that there's a part, an element of the gift of faith that is not needing to see the proof, the evidence, the logic, the rationality. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which are their Babylonian given names, so Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, walking into a fiery furnace, facing certain death. I would argue that is the gift of faith that was given by the Spirit at that moment. Daniel in a lion's den, I would argue, is the gift of faith given in that moment. And why I would argue that is it is a display of otherworldly logic in contrast with the logic of this world. And I think I want to caveat it that way. I don't think I want to say that the gift of faith is necessarily an illogical gift, but I think it's a logic of a different world. I think it's a logic that maybe sees the evidence in a phenomenological sense, right? And so the phenomenology of things is that lived, felt, and tasted experience that can't be explained. It's kind of where the metaphysical leaves the physical, if you will, on a philosophical sense. And this isn't absent, I think, from logic. I think if we go back to the fruit of the Spirit is love. Meaning, and you can see this in evidence, that the longer someone is a Christian and the longer someone actually walks with God, and I caveat it that way because I think there's a lot of church-going people that have been quote-unquote Christians their entire lives and aren't very loving, but ideally the longer someone walks with God, the more loving they are, the more peace they have, the more joy is evident in their lives, the more patient or long-suffering they are, the kinder they are, the more good things that they do, the more gentle they are, the more they exercise self-control. And so faithfulness then has no exception to the other ones. Faithfulness then is a byproduct of fruit growing and being produced of the Spirit. In other words, the longer you're a Christian and actually practice the things of Christianity, actually build the relationship with Christ, the more faith, works of faith, should be evident in your life. So there should be a trusting despite the circumstances. And I think we can see that in persecution. I think one of my heroes is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the pastor who went and started the underground confessing church in Germany, in Nazi Germany, and was eventually arrested and executed by the Nazi SS police. And I think his faithfulness was a fruit of the Spirit that grew, but he's also one of the most logical, rational Christians to live in the past 100 years. The books he wrote on ethics and on discipleship and on community are some of the most well-rounded, logical, philosophical Christian works I think we've had in a good long while. And so when I look at someone like that and I look at the fruit of faith in his life, well, it's anything but a blind faith. It's anything but a faith void of knowledge and reason and rationality. As a matter of fact, it's a faith that's probably all the more strengthened by those things, and a faith that others can be all the more strengthened by because of the logic and the rationality and the calculations that went into his faith. And yet, there's another element that, as I was kind of thinking through this, that came to mind. Jesus, when he's giving the Sermon on the Mount, kind of in the end of it, more towards the latter half of it, in Matthew chapter 7, he makes a striking statement to everyone listening, and probably specifically to his disciples. He says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds." And I thought that's a very interesting thing to say. And obviously you can take that from the reasonable, rational, logical point of view, and it makes total sense that the one who's willing to actually search out, the one who's willing to actually ask the questions, the one who's willing to, for lack of a better term, be skeptical, is the one who will find the truth, right? The one who's willing to go and knock on the doors and ask the hard questions and ask the awkward questions and push the boundaries of faith is the one who will see faith most clearly. And that makes sense to us. That's the scholarly thing to do. That's applying the Socratic method to anything. And this doesn't just necessarily apply to religion. This applies to mathematics. The more you dive into mathematics, the more you ask, the more you look at complex calculus and differential equations, the more you integrate, the more you derive, the more you formulate, the more you'll know, the more you'll find. The more you ask, seek, and knock, the more it will be given to you, you will find, and it will be opened to you. And there's an element of faith there that I don't think I've ever really fully thought of before. There's an element, let's take mathematics here for a second. There's an element of, I know that if I run out these proofs, I know that if I run out these differential equations and perform vector analyses and all of these different things, there is an answer at the end of it. And of course that makes sense because math is true. Math is mathematics. Whether we apply mathematics or not, math is going to work. And we know that. And yet we're confident in that. We have faith in mathematics. Now, it's a very evidentiary-based faith. You can run out all the proofs, and the evidence will point you to that fact that there is an objective reality to mathematics. And even as I'm speaking, I'm thinking about how in the book of Isaiah, God, through the prophet, tells the people to come and let us reason together, that though their sins were like scarlet, he'll make them as white as snow. And it's interesting to me because he doesn't say come and repent and do the works and the sacrifices. He said, come, let us reason together. And you go back in history a lot further, and there's a guy named Jacob, and he wrestles with God. And after that, God touches the socket of his hip and dislocates it, and he changes his name to Israel, from Sarah, which is to contend, and El, which is God. So to contend with God. And then after that, he says, you're my chosen people, to this entire nation. And he doesn't name them the nation of submissive, faithful people. He names them the nation of people that contend with God, the nation of people that wrestle with God. And so you have to ask, is this faith? You read the Psalms, you read the prophets, and there's an argument that happens sometimes. There's a Habakkuk, are you not from everlasting to everlasting? There are Psalms where David questions the goodness and the provision of God and wrestles. And so part of me is asking the question, and I genuinely don't know the answer to it other than to say maybe. But is there an element of the gift of faith where if you know you'll ask, it will be given to you? And if you know that if you seek, you will find. And if you know that you knock, the door will be open. Because like mathematics, there's an objective reality and an objective truth behind the question, behind the searching, and behind the knocking that is there to be discovered. And that there is an element of faith that tells you that it's so. That maybe the gift of faith is like that burning, driving ambition behind doubts sometimes, behind skepticism sometimes, that says there's no question too big, too hard, or too controversial for God not to answer and reveal. And then I kind of got sad because I thought, how many people have gone to churches and asked hard questions and been told, don't ask those kinds of questions, just pray harder. Or we don't talk about those things here. We don't believe that God needs to answer that. What you need to do is just pray harder and read your Bible more. And you need to have more faith. And yet, does not faith sometimes begin with a question and a doubt? Does not faith sometimes see Jesus out walking on the water and say, if that's really you, then you bid me to come out? Sure, great faith can be, and is very much so, a Lord, don't come into my house to heal my servant, but you just say the word and he'll be healed, like the Roman soldier said. And Jesus marveled at his faith, for he had not found such faith anywhere else, right? But sometimes faith is a question. And so, again, I don't know the answer to it other than just posing the question back to you and saying maybe, at the end of it, maybe the gift of faith is knowing that something is out there to be given if you ask. Maybe the gift of faith is knowing something is out there to be found if you seek. And maybe the gift of faith is knowing that there's something behind the door that you just need to knock a bit harder on. And I think it's a both and. I think that could be possible. And there's a very real gift of faith out there that says I don't need to ask, I don't need to seek, and I don't need to knock because I already have. I already know, I've already found, and it's already been opened to me. Therefore, I can walk forward in faith. And I gave the example of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, but I want to be sensitive to the fact that there is an entire world out there of persecuted Christians that are out there right now exercising the gift of faith. And I want to acknowledge that reality as well, that I live in a very materialistic culture. I live in the United States of America. We are an individualistic and materialistic society. We are a society with great scientific advancements, a field that my toe is dipped into as an engineer. And so I recognize an inherent bias that I possess within myself, that I'm in a culture that tells me the material and the felt world is more important than the phenomenological and the metaphysical world. And so I fully recognize that that's not every part of the world. That's not every culture that exists right now, and that the gift of faith is out there because so many Christians in other parts of the world don't even have access to scriptures and commentaries and books on philosophy and history and theology and all of these things that I am blessed with access to that also might hinder the gift of faith as it's seen in the examples that I gave in the book of Daniel. For me, for others, that might be their daily reality. And so I want to acknowledge that, and I think it's healthy for us to acknowledge that we live in a bubble to some degree or another. And even if you live in one of those countries, like everyone kind of lives in a bubble. And that's an important reality, I think, to think about for all of the gifts that are mentioned, is that there's a caveat. When Paul talks about the gifts, he says that the Holy Spirit distributes each one individually as he wills at the end of it. But at the start of it, he says the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. And so there's a beautiful uniqueness and sensitivity to culture that I think Christianity has displayed, not always, but has displayed throughout all of history. And I caveat not always because currently, spoiler alert here, I'm doing a lot of research on the Crusades. And so you can expect maybe an episode or two of those in the near future where we talk about those Crusades and what went on and all the craziness that happened. But there is a beauty in the manifestation of the Spirit that has been seen throughout all of history in Christianity. And we haven't even scratched the surface on healings and miracles. And we may not even know all the stories. Most hospitals that we have in the world were planted because of Christians planting churches and hospitals at the same time. And so we can only imagine the working of the Spirit through healings and miracles that might have happened in that kind of beautiful setting in time where that was the heart of Christians around the world. But to get back to it, my point is there may not be a need for the gift, the manifestation of the gift of faith to be super active and present in our American culture. And I reference back to a lot of people being burned by churches where doubts and skepticism and questions were met with a have more faith and pray harder response. And even as I say that, I'm questioning the use of the word manifestation that I just used, that maybe not manifesting in that way, but maybe, just maybe, manifesting in the way that says keep knocking, keep asking, keep seeking, because there's something to be found, there's an answer to be given, and there's a door to be opened. And so I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer to give you at the end of this episode. Just more questions. Maybe it helps. Maybe it helps at least for you to think about these things in a different way, in a different light. All joking aside, do I have the gift of faith? Maybe. I don't fully know. And if I do, perhaps it's not all the time. Perhaps it's in moments. And perhaps it manifests differently than the gift of faith that others have. Is my faith a gift? Absolutely it is. Is an increased faithfulness the fruit of the Spirit? Absolutely it is. And all believers can say those two things are true about their lives. And yet, there's a reality that there's a unique manifestation of the Holy Spirit through the gift of faith. And before we end, I want to circle back to an experience that some of you may have had where you've encountered a church that when they come across your doubts and questions just tell you to have more faith or pray harder. Which also, just as a side, is like the silliest thing ever, right? Because it's like, if it's a gift, how can they tell you to have more of it? Like, like I don't go to your house at Christmas and you're like, oh, thanks, I love these 3 presents. And it's like, well, you should really have 10 Christmas presents. It's like, yeah, I can't control that. Like, they're gifts. Like, someone gave them to me. Like, yeah, well, I don't know what you're telling me I need to have more of right here. So, like, it's kind of silly when you think about it. And I think as another side, I know we're like out of time here, but I think there's a reality in which the church should expect doubt and skepticism, because that's how we entered the world. Like, Eve encountered a snake, and there's an unhealthy side to this whole gift of faith conversation in which the church wants to do everything in their power to get snakes out of the building, which is probably a good effort because snakes are deceptive and evil. And I'm speaking in a metaphorical sense here, not a literal sense, although you probably shouldn't have literal snakes in church either. That's just kind of a nuisance. But anyway, in a metaphorical sense, there's a desire to get rid of snakes. And I think to the wonderful work called Harry Potter, in which the main villain, Voldemort, manifests himself through snake-like qualities. And everyone is so afraid of him that they don't want to speak his name. And then Harry Potter comes on the scene and he speaks Parseltongue. He can talk to snakes, and it freaks everybody out. And they don't know what to think of this kid. They don't know what to think of him, if he's like another Voldemort, or if he really is this like chosen one who's going to get rid of all the snakes in Hogwarts and defeat Voldemort. But I think sometimes the Christians can behave like that. If you bring a doubt into church, it's like, oh, you just said the thing that should not be named. Like, don't ever speak that again because, well, that's of the devil. But the reality is, the distortion of truth and beauty is of the devil. The doubt was Eve's response to the distortion of truth and beauty, because the devil was an angel. So ontologically, he has beauty and truth in him. But teleologically, that beauty and truth was distorted beyond recognition. And so that placed doubt in Eve's mind. And rather than questioning further and being a little more skeptical or having any more gift of faith, she just believes the devil. And so ever since then, humans have had this like reaction to doubt and skepticism. That is, don't speak the name. And yet you do that long enough and you do that with enough people in your church, and ultimately Voldemort ends up taking over. And ultimately everyone metaphorically dies, and hopefully not literally dies, but there's chaos and hell that comes in when you say, don't speak about your doubts, don't speak about your questions. And I think that too many churches in America have done that. And so I don't know that we fully need to separate. As much as I've done over the course of this podcast, I don't know that we fully need to separate faith, the gifting of faith, the fruit of faith, and doubts and skepticism. That maybe those with the doubts and skepticism are like Harry Potter and can speak a little bit of Parseltongue and might just keep the snakes at bay in a church, and might just keep Voldemort from coming in and ruling over that church. Of course, Voldemort being metaphorical here for Satan, for evil. And so, those are all my thoughts. Let me know what you think. What's been your experience with faith, the fruit of faithfulness, the gifting of faith, doubts, skepticism? How have you been treated in church? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show.